embraced motherhood as a holy occupation that is so desperately missing this morning, this last couple of decades. It's been increasingly less and less so where we recognize motherhood, parenting, as a holy occupation, and it is bothersome. Perhaps we should just come to the realization that every child is valuable, and God's design for motherhood is not an afterthought. It is part of His intent. It is a divine purpose, and it is pointed to glory. Now, it's motherhood. Mother's Day is a tough holiday. It's a tough holiday because on one hand, we want to talk about mothers and the glory of motherhood, and I want to do that. And at the same time, I want to make sure that I'm pointing us towards the Scriptures and towards what God has to say. And we can do both together, and I think we can possibly do that this morning because there is value in motherhood. And I want us to think as a church not necessarily only of motherhood here within our walls, but I want us to start thinking about the value of motherhood that we, male or female, can express to those around us. We can start reforming our culture by informing our culture of the glorious and joys of what motherhood is. We've got to raise that up again so that once again it becomes something that is valuable and viable for young ladies. We'll talk a little bit about that. For all of its sleepless nights, can I get an amen, moms? For all of its sleepless nights and endearingly frustrating moments, motherhood is a gift from God, and I think that's safe to say. For all of the heartache that comes along with it, for all of the joy that comes along with it, motherhood is a gift from God. It is by virtue of that exact same argument. So is fatherhood. And so see what I did there? I just might have absolved myself from the need to preach a Father's Day sermon. I don't know. We could just bring them both together and call it Parenthood. Happy Parenthood Day. And I'm bothered by this, and I've been reading about it more and more. Our society has been steeped in the ideology that views children at best as a nuisance, or at worst as an obstacle to be avoided. And I think that is a fair assessment of where our society is today. Children are a problem, not praise. Man, and it bothers me. If it doesn't bother you, may I just suggest that current, that ideology, that thought that children are a problem and not a reason for praise, and children are not viewed in our culture as a purpose. That's why we see so much of the hurt and heartache that we see around us. It's just the rise that seems to be, and I don't know whether it's just the news cycle is focused or whether we are seeing actually more of it, the rise of abuse. I don't know, but it's out there. I read stories this week on the rise of sex trafficking of children in the United States. I was so angry when I finished reading that. And let me tell you, my anger is nothing compared to God's anger. And that should bring fear to the hearts and minds of people. I remember a story a lot of times, and I know I've told it here, but I'm going to tell you one more time, of my grandmother when she was in the laundromat. And the reason I'm going to tell you again is because my grandmother told me this. I think probably every fifth time we went over to her house, we heard this story. And this was my grandmother's way of saying, I love you and don't forget it. But she told me she was in the laundromat and there was another woman in there and she was just complaining endlessly about her children. I mean, she was going on and on and on, this other woman was. And my grandmother was a patient woman. Fanny. She was a patient woman. I mean, she had 12 kids. 15 if you don't count the ones that didn't make it. We want to count those. That counts. She had 12 children. And after, she just couldn't stand it any longer. She walked over to this woman, and my grandmother, the only time she ever confronted me was never. You know what I'm saying? Now, that's not to say she didn't deal with her own children, but she fully expected my parents to do the parenting when I was over there, and she let it happen. Although I'm sure at sometimes my grandmother was itching for the switch. You know what I'm saying? Did your grandmother ever itch for the switch? Mine sure did. But she walked over to this woman and got face to face with her, and she said, and I know I'm going to mess up a couple of these numbers. She said, I have 12 children and 34 grandchildren, and I don't know how many great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, and I love every single one of them. She probably said something else. And I can only imagine this self-described. Every time I walked over there, how you doing, Grandma? Fat and sassy. This self-described fat and sassy woman. I can imagine her standing there with smoldering eyes, staring that complaining woman into retreat. And that woman did retreat right out of the building. I don't know if her laundry was finished, but she left. As my grandma, she embodied the idea that children were not only a precious gift, but they were the reason for what God had created her for, right? And I know that's not true of absolutely every woman, and that's okay. But it was for my grandmother, and I think she exemplified the value of children that the society needs. I wish a lot of people believed the way my grandma did. My grandmother, my mother, and thankfully my wife all viewed motherhood as the gracious gift of God rather than as a punishment to be endured or an obstacle to be overcome. Sadly, that's not a message making it into our culture today. Young girls, including young Christian girls, are being brought up on a continual message that parenthood is second class. It is settling for less than what you really could be, rather than the reality that design is a good and glorious thing. Young girls, including Christian girls, are receiving this message that children are a blockade and will prevent you from achieving and becoming something that will truly make you valuable. That's a lie. It is an absolute lie. For that matter, fatherhood is viewed as less valuable as well. I read an article this week summarizing this problem, and if you'll just forgive me for a little bit, I'm going to read a longer portion of it than I might normally. But he talks, read this about Andrea Burke. Now, Andrea Burke is a lady who leads a women's ministry at her church, and she writes a blog called For the Church. And she suggests that we're not always very good at honoring and encouraging future mothers. As a result, for too many young Christians, cultural attitudes towards motherhood are setting the tone, not a positive one. Burke calls motherhood the one life dream that makes a girl blush. Motherhood, the one life dream that makes a girl blush. So in her work directing this church's women's ministry, Burke will sit down often with single young women to talk about the future. And they usually confess that although they could pursue further education or a successful career or any number of fields, what a lot of them want is to get married and raise a family. By Burke's account, these young women are smart, they're accomplished, they don't have anything to prove to anybody, but they regularly talk as if choosing to be a wife and a mother is a silly cop-out and a waste of their lives. Yikes. She says, when a 21-year-old woman sits across the table from me and tells me that she wants to be a mother, she blushes and gives 1,000 caveats as to why she knows it's not the optimal choice. Conversations that she has. Young women who come to say, you know what, I really just want to raise a family. I want to be a mother. I'm sorry that that's not the best thing I could choose. And I think when I read that, how sad to not realize that that is a wonderful thing to pursue. She continues writing, where do young women get this low view of motherhood? Look around. According to the New York Times article last year, the average age at which women become mothers is now at a record high, 30 and up, in some parts of the country. The Times reported this as if it were a good thing, talking up the wonders of a fulfilling career and everything but openly suggesting that the only reason a woman would have children young is because she couldn't do something better. Yikes. New York Times, everybody. The Centers of Disease Control and Prevention reports that the average birth rate in this country has now fallen way down to 1.77. Now, if you don't understand and you never heard that term before, the birth rate has to be at minimum of 2 in order for a society to sustain itself in numbers. It has to be 2.1 or higher for a society to grow numerically. And we are seeing societal growth, but it's really only transfer growth. It's the same infection, by the way, that plagues a lot of churches. There's no new birth, but lots of transfer. 1.77 children per woman on average. That's down over 16% from a decade ago, just a decade. It's kind of sad. So there's a gap in our culture now between the number of children women want to have and the number they end up having. And the reason is because they're being taught that it's not a valuable thing to do. I wish we loved the strength that it takes for a woman to become a wife and a mother. We marvel at her physical strength, Andrea writes, when she births a child, but we forget what invisible strength she shows when she lays down her life for her home every single day after that. She continues, it's not to say that those who can't have children or don't have children or who aren't married, that they're inherently wrong. I'm just wondering if we, and she's talking about the church, if we as a church have to speak so condescendingly about those who have said the hard yes to the humbling and long-term work of marriage and family? Can we stop acting like she's chosen a simple, silly life? Can we stop talking about children like they're soul-sucking, dream-killing, money-grabbing leeches on society? Can we stop treating wives and moms with the eye-rolling disdain that says only the simple-minded woman would choose such an outdated path? Keep in mind, Andrea is not writing to the society as a whole. She's writing to the church where she has observed this attitude. So I want to correct that attitude this morning. I just think if I can just lay that out there and say we need to be intentional about encouraging and building up the glory of motherhood for young women and for building up the glory of fatherhood for young men. Now, there's not a whole lot of young women and young men in this building. I know that on a weekly basis. We see it. I can look around, I can see. But you know what? I'm getting waves from the back room there. I see you. I know you're there. You got your hearts in the right spot. But here's the reality. We go out and we interact with people all week long. And we have opportunities when that woman is complaining in the laundromat to turn around, and we could either assault her, bless my grandmother's heart, or we could redirect her passions to something that is greater. Right? God has in fact spoken on the issue, at least I think with some degree of clarity. God's design for Christian mothers and fathers is to pave the way for transforming society. So take a look with me at an Old Testament book, if you would, the book of Jeremiah. First thing that we read out of the gate here in the book of Jeremiah, and it would help if I was actually turning to Jeremiah while I was talking, is do not decrease. One of the reasons I have been personally told that Christian women these days question the viability of having children is because of the increasing wickedness around us. I have had Christian women, there's a plural there, say, I don't even know if it's wise to bring a child into this world, seeing as how horrible it is. And you know, on the surface, there's a big part of me that says, man, I get you. I get you. In fact, for the last 27 years, I got you. Because it's not getting better, it's not getting worse, but 27 years is my history of having kids in the house, or thereabouts. She's 27, right? Yeah, okay. Questioning whether or not raising children is wise to do in this world. And there is no doubt, if my experience is anything at this point, raising children who love Jesus in the midst of a godless culture is not easy. And we are in the midst of a godless culture. I mean, we don't even pretend to be a godly culture anymore, so at least it's easy. We now know who is and who isn't a devoted Christian. Can I just say that that is one of the blessings of the current trend of society? We now know who truly believes following Jesus is worth it and who doesn't. And that distinction is going to get more clear in the next, probably within 5 years, there won't even be a distinction to be had. But it's coming and it's growing, and yes, it's difficult to watch, but can I just say that somebody who's very moral and very nice and very good and goes to church all the time and doesn't believe in Jesus is just as lost as somebody who's completely immoral, never goes to church, and does everything that we would say is not in line with God's obedience, right? Just as lost. So all we're doing is gaining clarity on the mission field. You hear what I just said? All we're doing is gaining clarity of the mission field. Because we are on mission to reach those very same people. The problem is that growing godly children in a godless society is not a new issue. It's never been otherwise. There might have been a time when people pretended, but it's always been a distinction between believers and unbelievers, and it's always been trying to raise godly children in the midst of an ungodly culture. Here in America, we've only got a few hundred years of history, but the rest of the world has always existed in a society with varying degrees of belief and disbelief. Always been that way. So what's my point? Go back here to Jeremiah chapter 29. You find this interesting situation. Israel, for centuries, of idolatry and ignoring all of the prophets that God has sent, finally, after warning and warning and warning and warning and warning and warning, the warning came true, and they were sent off in exile to the nation of Babylon. Anybody that escaped the sword, the famines, the plagues, and the beasts that ultimately serve as God's judgment tools were taken captive away from Judah and made to live in Babylon. Now, if you don't know anything about Babylon, it is throughout the Scriptures, from Genesis all the way to the Revelation, Babylon is the epitome of godlessness. You see the word Babylon applied to a nation, a city, a town, it is because that nation, that city, or that town has epitomized what it means to be antithetical to God. Taken off to Babylon. This is the most godless place you can be. And there they lived in a completely godless culture filled with idols and dark spiritism and child sacrifice and ungodly values. They were surrounded by government and culture that hated Yahweh and which only wanted them to assemble into Babylonian society. My goodness, doesn't that sound like America today? Just act like the rest of us and things will get along fine. So they would lose their national identity. That was the goal. And that these Jews would become just like the Babylonians and nobody would be able to tell the difference. That was the goal. So Jeremiah writes them a letter, and that letter is chapter 29 of his book. And this is what I want you to hear, verses 4 through 7. Thus says the Lord of hosts. Anytime you read that phrase, I'm the God who has all of the angel armies behind me. Don't forget it. To all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them. What? Plant gardens and eat their produce. Huh? Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons. Give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on his behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. What do? When you find yourself surrounded by a godless society? What do you do when your values and beliefs are almost criminalized? What do you do when the world you live in is ruled by those whose every intent seems to want to uproot your faith and identity in Christ and make you just like them? Well, number one, create homes where the Lord is worshipped. First rule of business. Create homes where the Lord is worshipped. You settle in. He says, build your houses, live in them, plant gardens, and eat the veggies. He does not, by the way, outlaw hamburgers here. I just want to point that out. It may seem a little redundant. Build homes and live in them. Plant a garden and eat the vegetables. It might seem like he's being repetitive, but it isn't. Because you can take up residence in a place and not settle in. You can throw down your bedroll in a spot and not belong there. But that's not what is being exhorted on these exiles. Not to put their bed in a building and always yearn to be somewhere else. God tells them through Jeremiah, tells them what to do. He says just a few verses later that their captivity is going to last 70 years. That's roughly 2 generations. It's roughly 2 generations. About 40 to 45 years as a generation, so I'm averaging out. They are here for the long haul, and even though they knew they had a day coming when the future would come and they would be taken out of there, they are told to settle in, make a home, and let the worship of Yahweh become the center of that house. We're no different. We are here for the long haul. We don't know, however, how long our earthly captivity is. We don't know how long we're going to be exiles in this world. We are exiles in this world. We don't belong here. You know the old song, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. It goes on, they're all expecting me, but we won't go there. I'm just passing through here, I don't belong here. This world isn't mine. It's not yours. If we keep trying to pretend that this world was the most important thing to us, we got our attitudes and our hearts all set in the wrong direction. Put your treasures in heaven, your hearts will be in heaven. Settle in, live here, build a home, you, yourself. Older or younger, parents of children or parents of grown children, grandparents or not grandparents, singles, whatever. Build a home where Christ is glorified, number one. I don't care who you are. This is for everybody. This isn't just for mama. This is for everybody. Build a home, create a home where the Lord is worshipped. First and primary task as a Christian is not to reform the government. This is very frustrating to me. First and primary task as a Christian is not to argue politics. Also frustrating to me. First and primary task as a Christian is not to pass moral laws. First and primary task for me as a Christian. Very frustrating for me. My first and primary task is to build a home where Jesus Christ is worshipped. Military moves into an area. What's the first thing they've got to do? Clear a spot and build a camp. Right? That's what we're doing. Clearing a spot, building a camp. We're basically building a spot to launch out and do the stuff that needs done. First and primary task. It's not to fix everything out there, but to fix everything right where we're at. And it can't be just any old worship. The concept of God won't do. We need to worship the God revealed in Scripture the way that He's described Himself, to come to God through Jesus. Christian homes, first order of business. We know that sometimes that's a tall order in itself, and all of us can say amen, I'm sure. Sometimes we don't have the cooperation of everybody in the home. Sometimes that happens. You know what? First order of business, create a Christian home where God's name is worshipped. Sometimes there are obstacles we can't dream of, but at every time, it is not up to us to change somebody else's worship. First and foremost, to ensure that our worship and the pursuit of God through Jesus Christ is being done. So you know what? Even if you can't set the tone for the entire house, you can set your tone. Build a home where Christ is worshipped, number one. Take a look at number two. Build Christian families. Isn't this redundant? Isn't this the same thing? Not necessarily. Build Christian families. Very closely related to building a Christian home, but it's not the same thing. There is a mindset present in the second part that is not required for the first part. That mindset includes the value of children. He says, take wives, have babies, marry off. Marry off your sons and daughters so they can have babies. Then he says this, multiply there and do not decrease. I have never gotten out of my head. I watched a video, Vodi Balcom. If you don't know the guy, look him up on the internet. Lots of fun. Vodi Balcom summarized this passage by asking, what do Christians do when they're surrounded by a godless culture? Outbreed them. And I loved that every time he said that. He's right. That's exactly what Jeremiah is saying. Outbreed them. You know, the reality is our culture wants to have one or less children per couple. Fine. We should have more. And we had 4. We did our part. Honestly, we'd have had more if Teresa's health had held out, if my health had held out. You know, we had issues. Everybody's circumstance is different. This isn't necessarily individualized, but this is a pattern for the church to represent and for the church to encourage, is to grow our society through subterfuge. Just outbreed them. Thank you, Vodi Balcom. I will never forget that. Build a Christian family. Now, I'm past having kids. Most of us here are past having kids. Some can't, some won't, some do, some don't. That's okay. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the attitude behind it. Because the attitude behind it is where the activity sets in. There is something cultural here that applies to every single one of us, myself included, and we cannot afford to miss. The very last phrase he tells us, multiply there and do not decrease. God is not done with the godly family. Not done with it. He's not done with it. I mentioned this morning the value of when I brought home this little pink thing, I didn't know what to do with it. I mean, it's only a few days old, and it's squirming and pink, and sometimes it smells funny, and I didn't have an idea how to make it stop crying, and I didn't have I just didn't know what I was doing. I think my wife was blessed. She just knew. But I didn't have a clue how to handle this thing. And let me tell you, if it was not for the Christian people living right downstairs, her grandparents, I can tell you, I don't think I'd have turned into a very good father. I learned things. And that's the value of every single one of us who have had kids in the house or who have been kids in the house. We've learned some things, and we can pass that on to young couples around us. We don't know a lot of young couples getting married and having babies right now in the church, do we? No, but they're out there. And we have access to them. Some of them are our cousins and our nephews and our nieces and our brothers and sisters, and we can access them and encourage them in what they're doing. And that kind of moves us forward to the last part that Jeremiah gives us, and that's just in time because we're running out of time. Seek the well-being of your culture. Remember I said the first and primary purpose of a Christian is not to modify the government and write moral laws and do all those things? It's not the first and primary thing. First thing, build a Christian home. Second thing, build Christian families. Third thing, now you can get busy doing the other thing. But it's got to start with Christian homes and Christian families. Got to be a place where Christ is worshipped right here in our own hearts and our lives. Got to be a place where Christ is honored in the families that are around us. And then, and only then, with the camp fully built, with the fortress secure, then do we launch the attack, so to speak. Then we start trying to rewrite society by bringing people to Christ, by the way. That's the weapons of our warfare. The weapons of our warfare is not simply a pen. The weapons of our warfare isn't political domination. I wish it were. Political domination sounds so fun. Weapons of our warfare is for undoing the arguments against Christ. In other words, winning people to Christ, through which we transform the world. Seek the well-being of your culture. Strong desire to just let those first two principles govern everything. Oh, well, all I'm supposed to do is just kind of focus on me and my household. I can do that, and I can ignore everybody else. That's not where Jeremiah ends, and so it's not where we can end either. Building a Christian home, encouraging and raising Christian families, that's number one. Number two on the list, but the third one is not to retreat into the holy huddle and hide. We can't do it. We don't belong in the holy huddle. The title of a book, I never read the book. I don't know if the book's any good, but I loved the title from years ago. Get Out of the Salt Shaker and Into the World. You know, if you think about the church service, here we are in the salt shaker, and we're rattling around inside the crystal, and it's beautiful, and it's great. But you know what? In about 5 minutes, I'm going to shut up, and we're going to get out. And we've got salt to bring with us. God's design was for the subtle subterfuge of the gospel to work its way from the God-fearing family into the person next door, and from there to the person next door, and from there to the person next door, and from there to the person next door. Not to upend society with laws and political maneuvering or weapons, but to subvert society by bringing the gospel underneath and letting it saturate the ground so that the castles that are out there fall over. God's plan is for Christian families to overwhelm and become the community, the nation, and the world. Did you hear that? God's plan is for Christian families to overwhelm and become the community, the nation, and the world. So what are we supposed to do? Rubber on the road. Our task is to communicate the benefit, promise, and glory of children and the blessing and value of motherhood, specifically Christian motherhood and Christian fatherhood. Let me just give you something really simple. For example, if you see somebody in the store struggling with a screaming toddler, do not click your tongue and walk away saying, "Kid needs a whack." Don't do it. Can I just encourage you, please, to walk up to that poor woman if you feel so inclined, tell her she's beautiful and she's doing the right thing. Build her up. Build up the glory and the value and the purpose of motherhood. Encourage her, strengthen her. You see her there at the cashier checkout line, and all of a sudden you see her start putting things back because she realizes that she doesn't have the cash to buy for something. Check and see whether that's something the Lord wants you to take care of. I don't know. Build up, encourage, and strengthen these young mothers. Let's commit ourselves to ordering our own homes under Jesus so that we can seek to flood the nation with Jesus one house at a time. Look, I want to be as much on a national scale as anybody else. I'm all for the political maneuvering, and I'm all for... But you know what? That's not what God has called me to. The reality is, as Christians, our job is to build a Christian home where Christ is worshipped, and from there, to build more Christian homes in other people's lives.